Seems like quite an impressive little mansion behind you there.
It's a very pretty building, isn't it? And it's been here for a while. It's around 100 years old, and this building was the Cuban interest section for a long while. That is what essentially replaced the Cuban embassy that was in that same building before. Now it becomes a Cuban embassy again, quite palatial on the inside. There's a very interesting flag on the inside as well. This is a brand new one outside, but the one that was taken down in 1961, that is inside the embassy building, and very much a reminder of how long it took for these two countries to renew their diplomatic ties. Over 5 decades in which there's been no diplomatic relationship between Havana and Washington. That ended at midnight local time here in Washington. That is when this Cuban embassy became a Cuban embassy again. Now it looks all the more symbolic, of course, with that Cuban flag now fluttering outside this building.
Philip Crowther, many thanks for that. And we're going to put that question, why so long, to a historian who teaches at New York University, Timothy Naftali, co-author of One Hell of a Gamble, which chronicles the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 when the world held its breath. Thank you very much for being with us here on France 24.
My pleasure.
It took 54 years. Let me first ask you, could formal ties have been reopened any sooner?
Well, the history of relations between, because even though there were not formal diplomatic relations, the two states have been talking to each other over the course of the last few decades. There were moments when American governments came pretty close to reestablishing some ties. But for your listeners and viewers, what's most important to understand is that Cuba became a domestic American political issue. That's what made it so hard.
It became a domestic issue because...
Do this. Barack Obama, I'm sure, if you asked him, would say that this was on a list of things he wanted to achieve as president. But he couldn't do it in his first term because Florida has 29 electoral votes. And the way the American system works is you don't become president because you got more votes than the other person. You become president because more of the state electoral votes fell in your column as opposed to your opponents. So Florida, which has been growing in population, has become more and more politically important. It's a swing state between Republicans and Democrats. And the Cuban population in Miami was a single issue population. They voted not on abortion. They didn't vote on some of the other single issues that have been important in the last 30 years in the United States. They voted on what you thought of Fidel Castro. And they were committed until recently as a group to a very hard line on Cuba. What we've seen in Florida is the younger generation has drifted away from their parents. They're less seized with the desire to overturn the Castro family. But that took years. So it's the fact that it was a domestic issue that made it almost impossible for an American president to do anything. And I would say it was impossible for a president to do anything in their first term because they needed Florida to be reelected.
There was one moment after the fall of the Berlin Wall when it was thought things might change fast.
Well, actually, there I think the Cubans made a historic decision for themselves. I hope someday that the Cuban records will be open. The book that I wrote quite some time ago with a Russian was based on the Soviet-era records, which taught us a lot about Fidel and his brother Raul. But we've had very little access to the Cuban materials. In the 90s, the Cubans had a historic choice. The Russians abandoned them. They were running out of fuel. They went through an economic crisis. And I think there were people who thought that the Cubans would make the same decisions the Chinese made and would try to find a way of changing their economic system and opening to their former enemies. And they didn't. I think Bill Clinton, certainly after he was reelected, would have been very interested in correcting this policy. Look, the American policy of isolating Cuba didn't really work. It didn't work because America was almost alone in isolating Cuba. Canada, Spain, Great Britain, France, literally the rest of the world continued to trade with the Cubans. The United States was frozen in a policy established by Dwight Eisenhower and then continued and deepened by John F. Kennedy that, as I mentioned, was a domestic issue more than a foreign policy issue.
Now, wait a minute. On that point, is it simply the issue of the state of Florida, or is there something deeper in the psyche of the United States? Basically, a feeling of humiliation. Here was tiny Cuba stopping the Bay of Pigs invasion, where they tried to overthrow Castro, and of course, the standoff that scared the whole world in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, two things. One, as you know, we all love to talk about psyche, France's psyche, America's psyche. I think I would argue that the U.S. government understood why the Bay of Pigs was a failure. John F. Kennedy had larger global desires. He wanted a détente with the Soviets. He wanted to end the fighting in Southeast Asia. He's the one who decided that not to do what was necessary to win. I mean, invading Cuba would have won it for the Americans. He decided not to do it. And as far as the Cuban Missile Crisis is concerned, Americans did not blame Cuba for the Cuban Missile Crisis. They blamed the Soviets. And in fact, the Soviets blamed themselves, which is why Nikita Khrushchev gets kicked out 2 years later. Let's not forget another important part of this story. It's not a pleasant part of the story. And here, you know, left and right can agree on this. Fidel Castro, whether you say he was pushed by the Americans or not, Fidel Castro makes a decision in the 60s to go much further than the Soviets in pushing revolution in Latin America. The Cubans train guerrillas to overthrow governments in Latin America. They then send their troops to Africa. They participate as part of their commitment to internationalism, as they would describe it, to revolution around the world. The United States saw itself, understandably, as the leader of, you want to call it the free world or the status quo world or the non-communist world, any way you wish to describe it. And they had Cuba, which was actually forcing the revolutionary agenda against the wishes of the Soviets. So even, you know, long after the Cuban Missile Crisis and long after the Bay of Pigs, the Cubans are taunting the Americans. It's hard to believe. It's a small country. How could they do it? But if you look at their internationalist record, and so it's not just Reagan, okay, who's worried about this. Jimmy Carter is worried about it. Lyndon Johnson is worried about it. So there was believe it or not, there was a national security concern that the Cubans were supportive of armed revolutionaries. And the United States couldn't embrace this government if it wasn't going to change its policy on international revolutionary cooperation. Now, I think they have. I think that's actually part of the agreement with Cuba now. But it wasn't part of any agreement for decades. So let's not just view this as a frozen conflict from the Kennedy era. It also involves decisions made by the Cubans as part of their revolutionary commitment to sponsor guerrillas around Latin America and in Africa. Don't forget, the Cubans had a close relationship with the Algerians, and the Cubans got the Soviets to provide the Algerians with weapons. The Americans knew about this, and the Americans had their Cold War leadership requirements. You may not like those requirements, but that's what the United States believed in. It's not so much an issue of psyche, it's an issue of geopolitics in the Cold War.
Cuba's foreign minister at that ceremony today in Washington saying, "We have arrived here thanks to Fidel Castro." Once again, he's been long retired, and yet Castro looms large.
Well, the Cuban, you know, there's a great story to learn. I mean, this is an exciting time, okay? Not just for people who study Cuba, but it's an exciting time to see how countries that have a deep-baked enmity can get over it. The Cubans have to say that because, first of all, he's alive. Secondly, his brother, who frankly I believe was committed to the communist cause more than his brother. I mean, that's clear from the Soviet records. But there's, you know, Raul is president. He's in power. The Cubans have to explain to themselves why this country that Fidel vilified in his very long speeches for a very long time is worthy of being a diplomatic partner. So I think just as the Americans will have to say things to save face, the Cubans are going to say things to save face. And the most important thing to say is that Fidel looms over this and that, you know, it's because of Fidel. So that's part of the rhetoric that's necessary by states that are trying to bridge a deep gap. I want to tell you one story that your listeners may not know, and I think few people know. The Americans and the Cubans have cooperated over this period. This period wasn't completely frozen. The Cubans, the United States had a hijacking problem in the 1960s. People would hijack planes, not to destroy them. This is not like September 11th. They'd hijack planes to go to Cuba. And this happened repeatedly, 12 times a year, sometimes more. I mean, it was a big problem, particularly in the southern part of the United States. The Cubans welcomed these people initially, but then the people who came began to extort money from the United States government and to threaten violence. And the Cubans realized they did not want to be associated with this kind of activity. So the Cubans and the Americans, with the help of the Swiss, because it couldn't be done directly, they negotiated a deal that ended the hijacking problem in the United States in the 1960s. The Cubans basically shut it down, working with the Americans. They did it in the 1970s. It didn't get much press, but it was a decision on the part of the Cubans that it wasn't good for them, and the Americans were very grateful. So there was communication, and there were these efforts, periodic efforts, to go further than that. They never went much further until recently.
All right, so there's always, at some point or another, even when things seem frozen, there's a back channel chatter that's always going on. Timothy Naftali, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today from New York.